Well, hello again. What a pleasure it is for me to be back here at the Reagan Library. I've often said that every time I come here, I feel like I'm in a home of worship because I feel very reverent when I walk into this place, and I feel His presence. Maybe we'll talk a little bit about His presence today as we go on. Just to explain a little bit about me, what I did. Some of you've heard me before. But yes, I was military aide to President Reagan. It was an honor to be selected. It was a surprise, actually. I'll tell you how that all took place, if you care to hear that. But the way I like to conduct these type of get-togethers is very informally. I'm not going to stand here and deliver a prepared text. I would like you to be very interactive with me. Because you're the one that needs to know the information. There's very few of us that knew the president, were with the president, can relay to you what he was like, what he said, how he said it, and I think that's good information for you and your day-to-day workings here at the library. So please feel free to ask me a question at any time. There's microphones on either end, I'm told. They would like you to use the microphones for questions because it's all being videotaped. And they want to make sure they capture your question. So at any time while we're talking, please feel free to get up and walk over there and interrupt me. It doesn't matter. That's the way we'll conduct it today. Is that okay with everybody? We'll just make it an informal discussion and have a good time. I started out in the Air Force in the early 70s. And I started as a pilot, and then I went on through and flew fighters, and I was selected to the Air Force Thunderbirds early on in my career, and I flew with the Thunderbirds, and I left the team and at the end of my term, and I went on to a staff position at Langley Air Force Base in Virginia. And I'm doing my staff job, and I've been there about 8-9 months, and I get this phone call from military personnel center in Texas, and they say, we would like to know if you would be interested in interviewing for a position in Washington, D.C. And I said, yeah, what, young fighter pilot, heck yeah. What position would that be? And they said, military aide to the president. And I said, what is that? And I had no idea. And they said, well, it's position that the Defense Department says needs to be filled, and your name came up as one that would be good to go be interviewed. So I said, okay, and they said, all right, and I got a message a couple weeks later, or a week later, I guess it was, and it says, you're to report to the Pentagon river entrance at 2 o'clock on this date, and you'll be met by a person in a blue blazer with a presidential seal on the pocket, and he'll be driving a Chrysler Fifth Avenue dark blue in color. And I said, okay, and so I was there at the appointed time, and sure enough, there was a guy standing at parade arrest with a blazer on and so forth, and I walked out, and he said, Major Chealander, and I said, yes. And he said, open the door and get in, and they drove me to the White House, West Exec Avenue, and I walked me through to the Presidential Emergency Operations Center, and I went downstairs and interviewed with the 5 military aides that were in place at the time, and they said, okay, thank you very much. They took me back to my hotel and said, we'll call you. Well, about 8 o'clock that night, they called me and said, we'd like you to come back tomorrow for one more interview. Brash me, I say, mind me asking how many people got asked back? And they said, you're the only one. And so I went back the next day and I interviewed with the White House counsel and the director of the White House military office, who oversaw the military aides. And after that interview, that day, second day of these interviews, they said, okay, you've got the job. So I was to go home, get my family, move to Washington. They were going to start the process of a background check for my security clearance, which was a very high security clearance because you got to have the highest there is, because you're going to hear everything the president can hear, you're going to see everything the president can see. And so consequently, I had to wait a couple of 3 months, about 3 months before the clearance actually took place. So I moved my family to Washington, and we got our house all set, and they put all the communications in our house, secure voice, all those kind of things, telephones on the wall that connected directly to the White House switchboard. And I had these little kids, and I had to keep telling my little kids, don't touch that phone. And of course, when you tell kids don't touch that phone, what do? They, hello, who's this? So at any rate, we moved in, and I started training for the position. And the training was taking me deep into classified stuff. I was top secret clearance at the time, but I was waiting for the real clearance that could take me deeper into the purple world. And then about 3 months into that, 2.5 months, they came back and said, okay, your clearance is in, and you're in. So you are now military aide to the president. And they said, okay, so now we're going to train you deeper. So they took me more into the purple world. We talked about football, and we got into that and so forth. But then they said, okay, it's time for you to go meet the president. And so, okay, here's the day. So I put my uniform on, same one that's in Air Force One today. I went to the Oval Office and was outside the door there at the Oval Office, opens the door, Secret Service guy opens the door, and there he is, standing in front of me. And it almost takes your breath away when you stand there and see this, person, Ronald Reagan. And we go in, and he's got this little jewelry box in his hand. Shakes my hand, and they got pictures going and videotapes and all kinds of things of this meeting, and he's talking to me. And finally he says, well, he says, they say if you're going to be a member of this White House, you've got to be a cowboy. And he said, here's a little something to help you start that trek. And he handed me that little jewelry box, and I opened it, and it was a belt buckle. And it was a belt buckle that on the front of it, and I think it's in the belt buckle collection that's in here, but it has the White House embossed, and on the front of it, one of the Remington statue replications of the Bronco, the horseback rider, he's rearing up and so forth. It's right on the front of the White House. And down at the bottom of the White House and the Bronco, it says, "The Buckaroo stops here." And on the back of it, it's signed 40th President of the United States, Ronald Reagan. And I wore that belt buckle every time we rode horses, every time we cut wood, anytime we were wearing jeans together at the ranch, at Camp David, wherever we were, I always wore that belt buckle with him for the whole time that I served President Reagan. So that was my first meeting with him. And then there were other firsts. My first time on Air Force One, my first time on Marine One. I'll tell you that one real quick. My first time on Air Force One, I went with another aide, so I was receiving OJT aboard Air Force One. But on Marine One, you can't do that. There's not enough room to take 2 military aides, so you've got to go by yourself first time. So they're briefing me and telling me and so forth, and they basically tell me, all right, here's what you do. When you walk outside, you go around to the right. You're carrying the football. You go in front of the press, but you get around to the back door, and the president goes out and he answers or doesn't answer questions from the press. And then he waves at the people and so forth. He gets on, he salutes the guy. He gets on the helicopter, and you've got to memorize the manifest, because when you get on, you've got to make sure you know that everybody on board is on board. And Marine One was limited to 10 people. The other H-3s were limited to 14. So here's the first time. And they also tell me, look at the First Lady as soon as you get on and sit down and see if she needs to have the temperature adjusted. And so I've got it all in my mind. I've got it memorized, and here we go. So the president gets on the front. Mrs. Reagan's she's on board. I come around. I get in the back door. I sit down in my place, and I look around at everybody, and I count. Okay, yeah, everybody's here. Okay, Senator Baker, yeah, we're good. And they told me, then look over at the back door, and there'll be a Marine looking at you right there from the back door, and you just got to give him a thumbs up or he's not going to do anything. So you give him a thumbs up, and bang, he'll close that door. He marches to the front. They close the front, and away we go. Got it. Sit down. I look around. Everything is good. I look and see he's got his briefcase, President. She's got her little red train case. I check the manifest. The manifest is good. Everybody's supposed to be on board. I look at the Marine and I go, like that. He closes the door, boom, the rotor starts moving, and we're going to come off the lawn. And I'm sitting there pretty proud of myself. And we get up, we lift, turn, and start to go out the south lawn. And I feel this tap on my knee, and it's the President. And all he does is point at Mrs. Reagan. And she's sitting there with her arms like this. And I went, oh man, I forgot the one most important thing, the temperature. And so I picked up the phone to call up front to Dick Peasley, the guy that was flying Marine One, and I said, and he answered the phone and he said, "What took you so long?" And I said, "Yes, turn it up, turn up the heat." So that was my first ride on Marine One. Another first was my first visit to the ranch. And I was a California boy, and so I was always saying, yeah, I'll take the ranch duties, you know, and here's my first trip to the ranch, and it's the August recess of the Congress. And so we're going to be out there for 3 weeks, so we've been planning this and so forth, and I'm going to go out. I got several friends in the Secret Service, and they said, hey, come out early, 3 days early, and we're going to do a bunch of attack on principle drills where we practice different scenarios with the the onboard horseback and all those kind of things. We're going to have guys jump out of the bushes and with Uzis and so forth and see if we can spook the horses and make sure that we're doing all the right things. So I went out and I did that for about 3 days and at the ranch, and it was very, very good, very educational, and helped me a lot in doing my job, and also helped me on the horses, you know, because we ran the horses and we did things in the bushes and let them try to get used to gunfire and all those kind of things, so that we knew that how they would react in the event of an emergency. So here comes the appointed day, and I'm at the ranch, and Air Force One lands at Point Magoo, Marine One has them on board, and they're coming up to the helipad at the ranch, and they land up there, and we jeep them down to their house, little house at the ranch, which I'm sure you've all seen pictures of or actually been to the ranch. Many of you probably have been to the ranch and seen it. It's a pretty austere location, but it's really nice, very serene and a nice place. So down to the ranch they go, and they're all settled in, and I'm in the little hooch up top. I don't know if you remember seeing the one little building that was built up top. They said it was a Secret Service command post. Well, there used to be 3 buildings there. One of those buildings, I used to call it a double wide, but one of those buildings was for the doctor and the military aide. And it was a little 2-bedroom, like a trailer, you know, bedroom, or 2-bedroom deal. And it had a little dining room table and a little room and a television and a little kitchen, and wasn't much, but it was a place for us to stay. And so here we are that same day, about 5 o'clock in the afternoon. I'm sitting at the table. The doctor, Dr. Hutton, was sitting at the other end of the table, and we're just talking. And again, I'm pretty proud of myself, you know, because, okay, here we are. You know, we got the president on board, and away we go with my first ranch visit. And I look over at the door, and standing on the porch at the door is the president. And I said, Doctor, the president's at the door. He says, well, go over and answer it. And so I get up and I walk over and I open the door, Mr. President, and he's standing there with 2 bottles of wine. And he says, Steve, he says, I know this is your first visit to the ranch, and I just want to welcome you to Rancho de Cielo, and hope that you enjoy your stay here with us and all of that. You know, I'm military aide to the president, and he's welcoming me to his ranch. You know, this is really great. And he's got these 2 bottles of wine, and he says, I don't know what you're having for dinner tonight. He says, but just in case, here's white and here's red. And I take these bottles of wine, and I said, "Thank you very much, Mr. President." And I said, "Would you like to come in and have a glass of wine?" He goes, "Oh, no, no." He says, "I just wanted to say welcome aboard." And he turns and he leaves. And it was, you know, here I am, new to the job, and this is what I'm seeing, is this magnificent person. Well, the next day is my first horseback ride, and we go down to the stables, and the way we did that was the ride starts at 10:30. 10:30. Because President Reagan was always cognizant of what we did to set things up for him, what was behind the scenes that had to take place. So he was always on time because he didn't want to inconvenience us. That was President Reagan. And so we show up down to the Tack barn about 9 o'clock, and the Secret Service is there, and they're bringing their horses out, and we're all saddling our own horses. You got to take care of your own horse. You got to pick their feet. Got to do all the things you got to do to get ready to ride. President's there. He's getting the First Lady's horse ready, and he's getting his own horse ready, and he's talking, telling stories, and we're just having a good time out there. A bunch of folks just enjoying a horseback ride. So at 10:30, the horseback ride starts. Off we go, and we ride all over the ranch, and he goes wherever he wants to go, and we follow. And so we get back from the ride, and I'm unsaddling my horse, and I'm taking the bridle and stuff, and I'm putting him in the tack barn. And you probably saw the tack barn at the ranch. It's a small little room. It's got like 6 or 7 pegs where the saddles go. And so I put my saddle up, and I put my bridle up, and I realized that the president's in this little room too. And it's just the two of us in there. And he had just finished locking the little cabinets that are on the end of one wall, and he put the key back in a little drawer of a little table that he had over here. And so he puts the key away, and I think to myself, good opportunity to thank him for the wine the night before. So I said, "Mr. President, I'd like to thank you very much for the wine that you brought up." "Oh, did you enjoy that?" I said, "Yes, sir, I did." And he asked, "Did you have white or red?" And I said, "Well, the White House mess guys fixed us fish, so we had white." And he says, "Well, you want some more?" And I said, "Well, no, sir." I said, "I didn't say that just to try to get more wine." I said, I just wanted to thank you. He says, "Oh, no, no." He says, "Look at this." And so he goes over to that drawer, and he gets that little key out, and he goes back over to the cabinet, and he opens up the cabinet. And down underneath the cabinet is cases of wine. And he goes, "I'm not going to drink all this." He says, I get this from people all over the state of California. You know, they send them to me, and different vineyards and all of this sort of thing. So he gets down on one knee because his cabinet's down low. So he's down on one knee, and he's pulling bottles of wine out of different cases, and he's explaining to me the vineyard that it came from. He's explaining to me how they name wines in California. And I'm leaning over a hobby horse that's there with a saddle on it, and I'm leaning over this hobby horse, and he's on one knee down here. And it suddenly dawns on me that it's just the two of us talking. And we're just two guys talking about wine and stuff like that in a very, very informal way. And here's the president down on one knee just pulling them out, and I'm leaning over this thing like this. And back when I was a fighter pilot, my call sign was, or my handle was Jethro. And I remember saying to myself at that very time, as I'm leaning over this, after my first ride with the president, and I remember thinking to myself, "Jethro, if they could just see you now." It was the most amazing, surreal situation to be there in this little small room, the tack barn, with the President of the United States, and not only the President of the United States, but Ronald Reagan, and talking just like we're two guys just talking. And that, if I can say anything about him, that's who he was. The whole rest of the time that I was there to serve him, that's who he was. He was just a genuine, heartfelt man. He did everything from his heart. He cared for everyone. He used to say to me that you treat the person that empties the trash in your office with the same dignity as you do the head of the state of the Soviet Union. You know, and that's the way he was. He was honestly like that. Whenever he would walk into a holding room before a speech, we had all the holding rooms set up with all the communications and the medical unit, and all of those folks were in there. He would walk in there, and he would here's these young enlisted people that are, you know, standing at attention basically as the president walks in, but he would make everybody feel just right at home. And then again, it was just people chatting. He always made you feel comfortable. That's who he was. He was ever the gentleman. I'm sure you've heard the story of when we were going over to the old executive office building to make a speech. You know, he'd go over and you catch the elevator and you go up to the 4th floor and you go to the, I think it's room 435 or 450, 450. And that's where he makes a lot of speeches, the president. But when he goes, there's got to be an entourage. And so we walked across old exec, West Exec, and we walked into old executive office building, and the elevator door is open, and the Secret Service agent already had the elevator waiting for him. And the president stops. And there's a female agent in the detail. And he stops and says, "After you." And she says, "Well, Mr. President, this is my post, you know, and I'm standing post and I can't leave my post and so forth, so please go ahead." And he says, "Well, after you." And so she tries to explain it again, and then he says, "Well, you're still a lady. After you." And John Barletta, who a lot of you heard, he was in the detail, he said, "Joyce, get in the elevator or we're going nowhere." But that's President Reagan. That's Ronald Reagan. I mean, ever the gentleman and always caring. And I can go on and on with stories. You know, ask away if you've got things as we go here, or we can just keep talking about who he was and some of the different venues and so forth that I was in.
These are some of the questions that have come up in our capacity of doing research and trying to provide answers. When we get questions from our guests or people, docents say they heard this and they want to have additional information. One of the questions has to do with the football, of course, and there has been comments about, well, it's one officer, as I told you, Pat Dunn, who was one of the aides, said he never let it out of his sight. It was always with him on the airplane. Others, staff members on the aircraft, have said that it was between the two seats. I believe, and I'm not going to delve any further as to what you said because I wasn't there when it was said,
yeah.
But could you elucidate a little bit on the location of the football and how that was handled on the aircraft?
As I wrote back to you, the highest percentage of the time it went between the seats. You know, we would get on the airplane and basically just toss it down there, and the two communicators are there, and they're fully, you know, covered with security clearances and so forth, and it would stay there. I made a comment to the Republican women about, we were talking about the classified information and all that sort of thing, and a lot of it was flowing all the time while we were on Air Force One, and there was a safe over there to take care of a lot of that stuff. And a lot of that stuff came, was updates to me for football and things like that purposes, and I kept that stuff there. But I always put the football between the seats. And Pat Dunn, he was a nuclear submariner.
That explains it.
Okay. Pat Dunn was a good friend. He was a really good guy. He was the Navy military aide when I got there, and he was replaced while I was there with J.J. Quinn. I don't know if you met him. I brought him to the library one time, a long time ago, but he lives down here in Southern California.
The second question has to do with your uniform that is displayed there, and there are little badges on your lapel,
yes.
Which, after rigorous search on the internet, I'm still unable to locate them. And you've told me what they were at one time. I believe they have something to do with the position on the staff.
They designate an aide. If you have, they have ones for 2-star generals, 3-star generals, 4-star generals, secretaries, like Secretary of Defense, and they have one for the president, and they have one for the vice president. And the ones that are on my uniform there are, designate me as an Air Force aide, and it's presidential, okay?
Thank you.
That's what those are.
You also, I think, answered this question having to do with riding with the president and carrying the football. We do have the saddlebags
Yes.
here in inventory, but that was the case. You did ride with him. You did have the saddlebags with you that
Yes.
carried the football.
Yes.
Okay.
And I've got some pictures on my iPad I can show you of me horseback with those saddlebags that you have here. You can see the saddlebags. But we would break the football down when we were there, take it out of the case, the briefcase that we had it in, and we would put it in the saddlebags. And in the saddlebags, you can also see when in pictures, if you see pictures of us riding, there's a little antenna that's sticking up out of the saddlebag with a little red tip on the top of it, and that's the communications that we had in there.
All righty. Along that line with regard to the football, I have talked to some of the other folks, and they say there's more than one football.
Yes.
And they are strategically located in the event that something untoward would occur. Is that correct?
True. I mean, you have to have backup of everything and redundancy and everything. And there was a backup football. The secondary football was usually kept in the POC, which is the Presidential Emergency Operations Center. That backup football, by the way, I carried it once during the State of the Union address when everybody's in the Congress. And I mean everybody. The line of succession to the presidency is all located there in one place. Well, you can see a problem with that. So there would always be one designee that was designated to leave and go away. And one year at the State of the Union, I got the backup football, and I went with the Secretary of Agriculture, because he was in the line of succession. We got on board an 89th Air Wing airplane, and we flew to Colorado Springs during the State of the Union address. And we went to Colorado Springs, and the commander of NORAD met us, the four-star general met us, took us into their command center, and we watched the State of the Union address from the NORAD bunker. And when the State of the Union address was over with no incident, we got back on the plane and went back to Washington, D.C. But that's, I don't, you probably knew that, but a lot of people don't know that you've got to keep this line of succession clean. So.
Okay, two items having to do being in the White House itself. Number one, we understand that you were always within speaking distance of the president, but when he was in the White House and nighttime when people were supposedly sleeping, we presume that there was some sort of facility for you, and we've understood that it was in the East Wing. Is that correct?
Yes. It was in the East Wing, downstairs, right where that Presidential Emergency Operations Center is, just a couple of rooms away. They've prepared a small room. We used to say it's like sleeping aboard a ship, you know, in the Navy, but it's got a room, a sink, a little desk in there, a shower and everything, and we would spend the night there when we had the duty at the White House. And
related to that, you had your 24-hour duty rotational situation on carrying the football.
Right.
But you had other days there. What were you doing besides carrying the football as the military aide?
Well, the duty did rotate. It was, if you had the duty during the week, you would be to work at 7 o'clock, and you would relieve whoever was in the White House at that point, and you had the duty until 7 o'clock the next morning. You would stay the night in the room that I just talked about. If you had the weekend duty in Camp David, President Reagan went to Camp David a lot, and so if you had the weekend duty on Friday, we took off and went to Camp David, and Sunday we came back, and then once we got back to the White House on Sunday, we would spend the night at the White House, and then Monday morning turn over the duty to whoever had it on Monday. We were always in civilian clothes, coat and tie, suit, going and coming, even when you're on duty at the White House. And the football was kept in the POC, the Presidential Emergency Operations Center. And so anytime we were on the 18 acres of the White House, we were dressed like this, even in duty status, and the football was kept downstairs. Anytime we went off the 18 acres of the White House grounds, even to the old executive office building, we had to suit up in the uniform and carry the football. We also had contingency plans to, make it out of there quickly. If we had to, we could get the football and get out of there quick if we had to, even in the middle of the night. But that's the way the duty status rotated. If you weren't in duty status, there were many other things that were constantly ongoing, planning for trips and so forth. To give you an idea, the economic summit in Italy, Venice, Italy in 1987, June of 87, I was the guy that was going to take that trip, and so I was in charge of that trip. So I started advancing that trip in December of 1986, well over 6 months before the trip. And I took 5 separate trips to Europe to advance that trip. I spent 52 days in Europe just advancing that trip. I'd go with the Secret Service, the communications folks, the White House staff that were going to set up the visit and so forth. And that was a very complex trip. I mean, that was the economic summit. It was 9 days. It was in Venice, Italy. It was, obviously we can't move the president by motorcade. You got to move him by boat. So I had to get a bunch of boats from the Navy, and I got their admirals' launches from the USS Nimitz, and we armored them and everything else, and that's how we moved the president around for those 9 days. At the middle of those 9 days, we went over to the Vatican to meet with the Pope, so we had to plan that, and so that was part of the advance and so forth. To give you an idea of what we do in our off time when we're not on duty, that trip, I had to, as I said, get all these boats from the Navy. And so I got these admirals' launches, and we were going to put them aboard a big Navy ship, pick them up in Naples, sail around the boot, and come into Venice with these boats. And while we were sailing, we were going to outfit these boats with armor plating and make sure that they were all suitable for the president to travel on. So I had it all arranged. I had it all arranged where this big ship, it was a 600-foot ship, the USS Whidbey Island. And it's going to come into Venice, and we're part of the G7. So we don't want to come in and say, well, the United States is here, and we got our big Navy boat and drive it right downtown Venice. So we had it all planned to bring it into the back bay of Venice so it would be out of sight and so forth, offload the launches, and get them ready for the president to ride in. So I've got it all squared away on that trip, and I come back to the United States, and I'm at a PTA meeting in Washington for my kids' school. And I'm sitting there in the evening, it's about 7 o'clock in the evening, and I get this phone call, or I get my little pager goes off, and in those days it was pagers that just vibrated or beeped, and then you had to call a switchboard. And so I stepped outside of the PTA meeting, and I picked up my big phone. We don't have little iPhones then. We had big, So I get out and I dial the switchboard, and I said, "This is Major Chealander. Do you have a message?" And they said, "Yes, stand by for Major Peterson," and he's the Marine military aide in Venice. So we connect, and Pete says, "Steve, where did you tell this guy to park this ship?" And I said, "You know where he's supposed to park this ship. It's in the back bay of Venice." And he said, "Well, this guy drove it right downtown Ducali. And he's parked at the pier at the Plaza Ducali, And so I said, "Okay, I got it." So I hung up, and I called real quick back to the switchboard, and I said, "Give me the flag officer, who's the duty officer at the Pentagon." At the Pentagon, after duty hours, there's always a flag officer, a general or an admiral that's on duty for the Defense Department. So in this case, it was a 2-star admiral that answers the phone, and here I am, a major, and I call it. This admiral answers. I said, "Admiral, this is Major Chealander, a military aide to the president." And I said, "Here's my situation." And I told him real quick, and he knew, because he knew where all the ships were and so forth. He's monitoring all this stuff, and so he knew about the Whidbey Island. And I said, this guy parked it in Ducali, and it's got to be back here, and we have to be unobscure, I mean, because we're just one of 7 countries, and yada, yada. He says, I got it, Major. I said, thank you, sir. Hung up. About 15 minutes later, my pager goes off again. White House switchboard says, stand by for Major Peterson. Pete says, I don't know what you did. He says, but this guy's backing it up as we speak. So those are the kind of things that we're doing in our off-duty time when we're not in duty status with the president. And I mean, there was a myriad of them, whether we're getting ready to go do a speech in Washington, or whether we're getting ready to go to the ranch or Camp David or whatever it is, we're doing it. Because a separate emergency actions plan had to be drawn up for every trip we took. Now, there were certain standing plans. Camp David had a standing plan. The White House had a standing plan. The ranch had a standing plan for evacuation of the president or any emergency actions that we had to take. But every place else that we went had to have a full plan put together. We had to have a level 1 trauma center available. That level 1 trauma center had to have a White House phone that was a direct line in it before we could bring the president to that location. The standing plan was in effect when President Reagan was shot. And you see how quickly they got him to George Washington Hospital. That was all planned. They knew exactly where they were going. They knew the team that was on duty at the time. They knew all of that. And so that's how that's what saved his life, basically, was that we had that set up in that standing plan. But that has to be set up for wherever the president is. And in Venice, the same thing. We had to have all that set up. That trip, by the way, did you have another question, Jim, that you wanted to?
It's vaguely related, but go ahead.
I just wanted to follow up on that because this is one of my favorite stories, and you may have heard me tell this one before. I apologize for the redundancy. But this very trip, the Venice trip, at the tail end of it, when we finished it, the Economic Summit, we were going to go to Berlin. And he was going to participate in the 750th birthday celebration of Berlin. And as part of that, they wanted to talk to different people that were instrumental in the history of Berlin. And so on our first advance trip, when we were sitting in Berlin and talking with the German counterparts and so forth up there as to what we expected on this trip, the assistant to the president, which is the highest level, Ed Hinke, he suggested that the president would walk through a cordon of people that were instrumental in the history of Berlin, like the Bundesfrau, several of the women that helped brick by brick put Berlin back together after the war, several people from the Wall Patrol, at Checkpoint Charlie and all those type of folks. And they also wanted to meet some Berlin airlift pilots. And so my father was a Berlin airlift pilot, so I just mentioned to Hinke, I said, hey, my dad was a Berlin airlift pilot. And he goes, really? And I said, yeah. He says, well, do you think he'd like to come to Berlin and meet the president? I said, yeah, he could do that. And they liked that idea because they thought, wow, this is really good, military aid to the president, his father, Berlin, yada, yada. So they saw a real opportunity here. So long story short, we go into Berlin after the deal, and my parents were flown over by the State Department. Both of them were there. So I fly in on Air Force One. We land at Tempelhof. I get off, and I can see my parents standing over there waiting for, this next part of the event. But before we do that, we have to motorcade down to the Reichstag and the Brandenburg Gate, and that's where the president made the speech, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. And so he went to the Brandenburg, he made the speech, we come back to Tempelhof, and then he goes and meets these folks. He meets my dad and my mom, and then goes on into the holding room before he's going to speak to about 2,000 people in this big room at Tempelhof Airport. And so after he leaves the holding room, he goes up and gets on the speech. My dad and mom and I go out, and we're standing at the end of the stage, kind of right over here, and he's talking like this. And so he's making this speech, and in this speech he talks about how my father, he met these Berlin airlift pilots, and he talked about Gail Halvorson. Gail Halvorson was the candy bomber that came up with the idea to drop chocolate candies attached to little parachutes made out of handkerchiefs that the wives of the pilots put together, and they'd throw them out to all the kids there in Germany during the airlift. So Gail Halvorson was there. He talked about meeting Gail Halvorson. And then he said, and as for Colonel Alan Chealander, he said he had just returned from the war, and he was going back to school, and he was recalled to come back to Berlin for the airlift. And he never hesitated. He said, we had a job to do, and we did it. And President Reagan said, those are the words of a hero, and all of this. And he said, and they never hesitated. His wife and infant son, and Major Chealander, went back to Berlin to fly the airlift. And he says, I'm proud to say that that infant son that went back to Germany is now my military aide, and they're both with us here today. And so he said all this in this speech, and it was very touching. You know, both my father and I were very touched by it. And so it's all over, and we get back on Air Force One, and we're flying back to Bonn, Germany first. We stopped there for 2 hours to go talk with Chancellor Kohl. And then we got back on Air Force One and headed back to Washington. So we get back in, long day. Get back in. We didn't see much of him on Air Force One. We landed Andrews, we get on Marine One, and we're flying back into the White House. And we're about halfway back to the White House, and the president taps me on the knee and says, Steve, where are your mom and dad tonight? And I said, they're still back in Berlin, and they're coming back tomorrow on the C-5 that's carrying your helicopters. And he starts talking about how much it meant to him to meet my father, and what people like my father meant to our country. And it was more about what my dad did and who he was and what he stood for, and all Americans, than it was just about my father. But it was a very touching thing to me to just sit here and listen to the president talking to me late at night, coming in on Marine One. And he said, I wish I could do more for your father. And I said, Mr. President, I said, what we just did was really spectacular. He says, well, I know. He says, but there's got to be more I can do. He says, do you think tomorrow when they get back to Washington, you could have them come by and see me one more time in the Oval Office? And I said, I think I can arrange that. And he says, but one more thing. He said, he reaches in his pocket, and he pulls out the speech cards that he used to make that speech about the infant son and military aide and my father. And he says, I'm supposed to turn these into the National Archives, but I don't think they'll ever miss them. And he lays them on his table, and he signs them, and he says, here, give these to your father. And I have them with me right here today, so if you want to take a look at them, I have them. The library has copied them, and so they've got them in copy, and I don't know where they are in the library, but they do have them in copy. And it's also if you go down into the archives and look at his speeches, you can read it in one of the books. I've done that before and looked and seen that speech in there. But that's one of my favorite stories about President Reagan and what kind of person he was and what this country meant to him and what the people in this country meant to him. I already told you about the person that empties your trash, dignity, same as head of state. That's the way he was. He often said if he could, he would have shaken hands with or hugged every American in this country. And I truly believe that he would like to have done that. I mean, we were in Moscow, and he snuck out the back door and went out with the people. The Secret Service drove him crazy, but he went out and he started shaking hands with just everyday Russians. And they loved him. You know, they just gathered around him. It kind of scared the Secret Service a little bit, but they wanted to touch him. They wanted to hear him. And he couldn't understand them, and they didn't understand him, but it didn't matter. I think they did understand who he was because he touched them. And, but that's who President Reagan was. He was, I've often said, he was the grandfather, he was the father, he was the friend, he was the brother, he was the person that you always wanted to have in any of those types of positions. But he was a wonderful guy.
Steve, one final item. I know that you have retired from being a pirate working for Airbus, but in any event, would you tell us now a little bit about yourself post-retirement? I understand you're now in the Phoenix area, and we hope to be seeing you here a little more frequently in the future.
Yes. Yes, I retired December of last year, my 4th retirement. And I am relocated now to Goodyear, Arizona. My wife and I built a house in a place called Pebble Creek. It's a 55-plus community on a resort, 2 golf courses, and we're loving it. We have a motor home, and we travel around in the motor home, love that. But I'm not interested in doing any more, of the corporate grind and working that way and the politics of different big things and so forth. So what I do now is, as a matter of fact, Royal Caribbean Cruise Line contacted me a year or so ago and asked me to come talk about safety and stuff because I did have a position on the NTSB as a board member. I was appointed by President George W. Bush to be one of the 5 board members on the NTSB. And from that vantage point, I got a really increased interest in safety and public transportation and all that sort of thing, more so than I had as an airline pilot and all that. But it had a different passion now. And so I went to speak to them because after Costa Concordia, the Italian cruise ship, all the cruise ships started really getting concerned about, their safety culture and so forth, and they wanted an aviation perspective, and they got my name from several people and said, you need to talk to Steve and he can give you a perspective on it. So I started talking to them and their senior management, and they liked it so much they put me on their maritime advisory board. And I've attended several board meetings now in Amsterdam and Madrid, and I'm going to another one in October that's going to be over in Papenburg, Germany at one of their shipbuilding plants. But I do things like that, that are quarterly meetings and things of that nature. I give a lot of talks on safety. I just gave a speech to a group down in Orange County on Friday on aviate. They were a bunch of aviators. That's the toughest audience for me to talk to because, they've all got their ideas, and especially the pilots that have been around for a long time. They think they know it all, and I'm not throwing myself into that category, but they, it's a tough audience. But I spoke to them on Friday about aviation safety, and because I've seen an awful lot of things. I was the board member that was in front of the microphones for the Buffalo, New York accident, Colgan Air that crashed in '09, and I was the one you saw at the press briefings for the first 4 days after that accident. And so I have a different perspective on that, so I do a lot of that. I still speak a lot on President Reagan. I've done that ever since we left office. I've spoken to a lot of groups. I was here speaking when we accepted Air Force One. And Joanne asked me to speak with Governor Pete Wilson, so Pete Wilson spoke, and then I spoke, and then President Bush came in, and I got the Air Force Thunderbirds to fly over the library for the opening of Air Force One when we cut the ribbon. And so I'm participating an awful lot in those types of things. And just a real quick note on that, I helped procure Air Force One. Joanne called me years before we even had it, and she said, hey, look, they're going to retire Air Force One. Can you help us with your contacts get it? So we all worked together, and we got it. And then they took it, they're going to fly it into Norton Air Force Base, and so I was invited down for that. Mrs. Reagan was there and so forth. And at that meeting, when they flew Air Force One in there on its last flight before they disassembled it to bring it up here, Joanne asked me, she said, Steve, can we get your uniform and we'll receipt it, National Archives, all that sort of thing, but we don't know what we're going to do with it yet, but in the future we would like to maybe put it in one of our exhibits. Yeah, I said, sure. So I got my uniform to them, and they gave me a receipt from the National Archives, and I didn't see or think about it for 2.5 years or so. And then Air Force One, you know, sat up here gathering dust for years until Boone Pickens wrote the last check, and then they built the pavilion, and they put it in and put it all together, and then we started putting this big ceremony together to open it. President George W. Bush was going to come speak and cut the ribbon with Mrs. Reagan, and on and on. So I show up about 2 days before that event, and I'm helping them with the last minute touches on Air Force One. This goes here, this goes there, and, you know, making sure that it's authentic. And at the same time, as people were showing up for the ceremony, arriving, Joanne asked me if I would take people on tours of Air Force One as they arrived, special guests. And I said, sure. So I start taking people through Air Force One and explaining different things and different groups, and the time's getting closer to the actual event. And the night before the event's supposed to happen, the Presidential Honor Guard shows up, and Joanne says, could you take one more tour, Steve, through the airplane? Yeah. The Presidential Honor Guard. Sure. So I take the Presidential Honor Guard through, and as we get to the senior staff cabin, there it sits. And this was my first time seeing it. And I was baffled. I mean, I was just kind of blown away by, you know, the honor of having my uniform sit there on Air Force One. And interestingly, I had along with me another young lady that was with us at the White House, knew Joanne very well, and she was kind of tagging along with the Honor Guard as we went through there, and her name was Kim O'Brien. I don't know if any of you have met her, but she worked in the advance office as well years ago. She's along with, and she's a real pistol, so she'll blurt out anything anytime. And so I'm standing there and I'm looking at this mannequin, and I said, wow. I said, that is really an honor to see my uniform there and so forth. And I said, but the mannequin, I said it has hair. And Kim O'Brien in the back, she blurts out, she says, yeah, but it's Sam Donaldson's hair. So that little story that was going on, but we were all part of that. And then the next day came, and you know, I spoke, and Governor Wilson spoke, President Bush spoke, and, you know, one little sidelight there, I was sitting kind of right here when President Bush was speaking, and I had the Air Force Thunderbirds airborne. They had already taken off out of Nellis, and they were sitting up on a tanker, and they were refueling, waiting for us to call them down for this flyby. And I had a cell phone, and it was hooked up here like this, and the weather was bad. That day. It was real foggy and so forth, and so we were concerned whether or not we're going to be able to even see them. And so there's a decision to be made. Do we bring them down and still try to fly them across, or what do we do? And so I'm saying bring them to the initial point and get them ready to come in, because we're getting ready to walk up the steps with the president, and we're going to, you know, do all this. And so I'm sitting here trying to be real quiet when I'm talking. President Bush is making his speech, and he kind of looks over at me and goes, and I said, I'm sorry, Mr. President. I'm trying to get the Thunderbirds, and he goes, carry on, you know. So at any rate, we talked to him, we get up the steps, here we go, and I'm still talking to him. I said, bring him on, and I look over at President Bush. He's getting ready to cut the ribbon, and I'm standing back up on that balcony thing up there, you know, back a little ways. I can still in eye contact with him and an aide that's with him, that's kind of behind him. And so I looked at him and I said, you know, what do you want to do? And they said, bring him. And so I got them, and they're 30 seconds out. You know, they're all in formation now, and you can't see anything. It is so foggy. And so they said, bring them, and at the 30-second point. And so I made a quick call to the guy that was standing outside on the radio. I said, bring them across and make them loud. And so 30 seconds later, here they come. And they lit up the afterburners and go flying across and just rumbled the whole room, you know, the whole museum. And the commentator said, "Ladies and gentlemen, that was the Air Force Thunderbirds," you know. And President Bush, you know, he gave a thumbs up and so forth. We didn't get to see him, but we heard him.
Steve, thank you very much. We do have some folks that do have to go out on the floor here. We really do appreciate your time here today, and we hope to see you here again.
You will. At any time you want me to come back over, please feel free to ask. I love coming here. I love being in the library. I'll come anytime. So thank you very much. It was a pleasure.